everyone. Today, Daniel and I are back and here to talk to you about the similarities and differences between the Yom Kippur War in 1973 and the Ukrainian conflict going on today. For one, there is Russian involvement in both conflicts. A lot of people don't know that in the Yom Kippur War, the Soviet Union supported the Arab coalition with practically unlimited weapons and supplies to destroy Israel.
True.
Yeah, they're actually close to landing divisions in Israel to intervene if Israel wouldn't allow supplies to pass to the Egyptian Third Army. The historical alternative scenario of not caving into the demands of the superpowers and continuing to destroy the Third Egyptian Army can be tested in the Sagger simulator, downloadable at sagger.com with 2 Gs. So now for more similarities between the Ukrainian war going on today and the Yom Kippur War. One I can think of is a small country fighting off aggression from a bigger neighbor. So
this is the biggest similarity probably, that you have a case of a small country, smaller country. Ukraine is not as small country like Israel is, but in comparison to huge Russia, Ukraine is pretty small. And here you have this powerful aggressor. In one case, this giant Russia attacking Ukraine, and in the other case, the Arab world, which is also huge, attacking the little Israel. So that's probably one of the bigger similarities between the two countries, the two situations. And the two countries, instead of being intimidated, decided to fight back and defend themselves. So they believe that they can save themselves by fighting. And it looks like that strategy is panning out in both cases. Israel was able to fight off the Arab attack in Yom Kippur War and ended up winning the war after suffering some horrific losses at first. Ukraine similarly suffered terrible losses, and it looked like the whole war will take maybe 2 or 3 days. The world was just looking at this operation on February 24th this year, thinking that this will be over in a couple of days. And then Russians got stopped in Kiev area and then got beaten back. So that there was a big victory of the Ukrainians. Akin, very similar to the Israeli victories. Although in case of Ukraine, we're talking here when the war is still going on. So Ukraine is still fighting. And the difference here between the two wars is that Arabs lost relatively quickly, within a couple of weeks. Here, 2 months later, Russia is still fighting and preparing new offensive.
although you could say that the Arabs didn't exactly, they lost that war very quickly, but the conflict continued. It's still going on today. Israel has to protect its borders, and although there's peace with Egypt, it's a cold peace. There's still problems with the northern neighbor. I was just thinking that another similarity is how both countries were defending their homeland, and like Clausewitz says that attack is a weaker form of warfare. The defense is stronger. So Ukraine and Israel both have the advantage, and their soldiers are both using, they're motivated to defend their homeland. They're getting attacked in an all-out war to completely destroy the country. And both countries were using mobile, flexible defense with highly motivated and brave soldiers. Yeah.
Big similarity is that both countries are fighting in a flexible defensive style, which means decision on the battlefield is delegated down the rank to the lower officers who are actually conducting the battle. The colonels, the captains, they are making important decisions. Whereas the attackers, in both cases, Arabs and the Russians, are more staid, more structured, and how to describe it? Not structured, but
Just a much more rigid command system.
Rigid, yeah,
And
that's a good
I
word,
would say
rigid.
that in Yom Kippur War, probably Egypt may have been successful at even taking all of Sinai if they would have had more flexible defense like Israel, because they had some very brilliant commanders like General Shazli and Wassel,
Yeah,
that if they would have had their way, and they didn't have to report to politicians at the top that didn't really understand what was going on the battlefield, they may have actually prevailed over Israel.
yeah, both
Um,
Russians and Arabs had some and have some very talented officers that could make a difference. But the way they fight, the rigidity of command that prevents them from being successful stems from the way their society is organized. Both Russian society and the Arab countries are more of a dictatorial type of societies, where the leader at the very top doesn't trust his army, doesn't trust his commanders, and the leaders at the top want to keep the full control just in case the generals or the colonels decide to knock them out of their perch. So they maintain full control over the battlefield. Countries like Ukraine has a very long traditions of like free for all sort of like full Cossack democracy going back 300 years. Israel also a very democratic country. Every Israeli feels that they know better, so
it's
their
like I actually
society
come in with a
allows.
joke that Golda Meir said, where she said, Henry Kissinger said, I'm president, I'm Secretary of State of the United States, and she said, Mr. Secretary, I'm Prime Minister of 3 million prime ministers. So
Yes,
that's very much how it is, and that was even my experience recently in serving in the IDF. Definitely not hierarchical command, a lot of power given to lower level soldiers. And that's what we have in Ukraine, fighting Russia today, and Yom Kippur War. Actually, the Arab military doctrine was based on the Soviet doctrine. So there's a lot of similarities between, you could
but
say that
both
Israel
of
was sort
those
of fighting.
they reflect the societies, the armies.
Mhm.
Their structure and method of fighting reflects the society. You have authoritarian countries, the big authoritarian empires and dictatorships attacking smaller, democratically run societies, societies with deep democratic traditions, and it shows. And the effects are that the bigger army is unable to beat the small army, because those Cossacks in Ukraine, they are just quick and they move around and they hit and run attacks, and the Russians just cannot prevail over this. They will keep on
Well, there's
trying.
also the element of defending your homeland. When you're fighting for
Oh, very
survival,
much so.
you're much more motivated, and like Clausewitz says, that defense is a stronger form of warfare. So this gives the Ukrainians and gave Israel the upper hand in
And
that respect.
this defense of the homeland goes further than that. You are defending against enemy that denies you the right to exist. Arab goal was overall, I'm not saying some specific person, but overall goal is to get rid of the Jews from the Middle East. Russians basically believe that the Ukrainian nation doesn't exist or doesn't have the right to exist, that they are just like part of Russia and they should join the mother country, and they deny them the
Yeah.
right to their
Although
own
I beg
country.
to differ on one point. There is Sadat in Yom Kippur War, Egypt wasn't planning on destroying Israel. They didn't believe they had the strength to do that, and they weren't planning on that. It wasn't. In fact, they weren't even planning on reaching the passes. They were content with just capturing a narrow strip of land on the east banks of the canal, and just sitting under their SAM umbrella to break the status quo.
True, true. That was a specific strategy that Sadat himself espoused. But overall, Arab attitude was the society was that Jews do not belong, or at least if they are there, they should serve as a subservient entity, second-class citizens to serve their Arab masters. And yes, Sadat didn't believe that, but Assad, the prime minister of Syria, he just fought to destroy the whole of Israel. He wasn't going to stop quickly. He just wanted to finish off the whole country and get rid of all the Jews, like
Well,
Putin
he didn't
trying
believe
to
he
get rid
could.
of.
He planned on taking just Golan, but if he would have been able to, he would have. He expressed desire. He has expressed desire to capture much more than just Golan. Sadat
No, he
didn't,
was
but
limited
Sadat
by
didn't share.
abilities. He was
Yeah,
limited by his abilities, not by his goals. Because the
yeah.
goals
But
were, if
but Sadat, on the other hand, actually his goal from the beginning wasn't to capture all of Israel. Sadat wanted to break the status quo, and then in '79,
no, Sadat was
they
a
had a peace
realist.
agreement with Egypt.
Sadat was a realist, and he realized that beating Israel into the ground and just destroying all of Israel was way beyond the means of Egypt. But if that were possible, I'm sure he would gladly oblige and he would destroy Israel completely if he could. Um, in case of Russia and Ukraine, Putin really believed that he can just do away with the whole Ukrainian nation and just destroy them all. But the key is that both of those nations, Ukraine and the Jews, are fighting for their survival. They are not fighting for some better political position, to keep a little bit more territory or get some trading rights. They fight for survival of their nation. So they are like with a guy with his back pushed to the wall. They will just fight to the end.
Yeah. Yeah, that's definitely a similarity, and that's a warning that Sun Tzu says is never always give your enemy a way out, because you never
True.
want to fight someone that has no escape, where they're fighting for where they have nothing left to lose, and they're just fighting for their homeland. And that's what Russia is facing, and that's what the Arab coalition faced back in 1973. So we talked a lot about similarities, but let's move to some differences between the Ukrainian conflicts going on today and the Yom Kippur War. And one thing I can think of right away is that the whole world is supporting Ukraine with arms and other supplies. While Israel got only some support from America after some very rigorous arm twisting, basically blackmailing with going on nuclear alert to get the US to wake up and quickly initiate Operation Nickel Grass to transport like much needed equipment to the battlefield. On the contrary, Ukraine is getting support from many Western nations.
Yeah, this is a big difference. It probably stems from, I hate to say that, but there is certain latent anti-Semitism in the world, and also fear of the Arabs, that Europe just uniformly didn't want to support Israel, just refused to support Israel. So it was probably fear of the Arabs combined with certain anti-Semitic feelings here and there. In case of Ukraine, the world doesn't have any problem with Ukrainians. There's no dislike of Ukrainian nation, so everybody is sympathetic to them, and the whole world is trying to help them. But like the fear of Arabs in '73, the fear of Russian nukes is a similarity here, because the whole world helps Ukrainians, but in a certain timid way. They didn't impose, for example, no-fly zone above Ukrainian skies, because the world is
Yeah,
afraid of the Russian nukes. So that there is some similarity here, that level of support for Ukraine way bigger than support for Israel, but still it's not sufficient, not the way it should be, and the reason is fear of Russia.
yeah, that's a good point too. That back in '73 there was a huge fear of Arab oil embargo,
Yes.
because the embargo in *67 wasn't very successful, because Israel was able to, or not Israel, but the U.S. and the rest of the world was just able to make up for the lost supply with Venezuelan oil fields, with Iran, and in '73 they didn't have those same options. And the oil embargo that happened as a result of Operation Nickelgrass, the huge arms lift to Israel, was devastating. People that can remember back in '73, I've seen the pictures of cars just lined up for
Yes,
miles trying to get
yeah.
to the gas station. So it was a very real threat. The Arabs met, the Arab coalition met in Kuwait at the Kuwait conference on the 17th of October to talk about how they could use oil as a weapon, and they meant it and they did it, and it really did hurt a lot of countries, including the United States.
And the Arab world is so much bigger than Israel that the friendship, good economic relationship with the whole world, dozens of countries, for self-benefit of each other country, it's better to be friends with the dozens of Arab countries with oil than with little Israel with no oil. In case of Russia, there's probably mainly not, there's no oil. Well, there's also actually oil dependency too, because the Russians are using oil weapons against Western Europe, against the Germans specifically, who became like totally dependent on Russian oil. So there is similar element of the oil as a weapon, but I think even bigger is the fear of Russian nukes. That, hey, like Putin, maybe he's crazy. We don't think he's crazy, but maybe he's crazy. What if he is? It's unthinkable he will use nukes. So there is that fear too, and that's similarity. Fear of the bigger country and willingness to abandon the small country, or at least not to help them as much as one could, for fear of the big nation, of the big aggressor.
Yeah, that's
Uh,
true. So it's both a similarity and a difference there.
uh,
Um,
Another similarity is probably the level of brutality that the big country is inflicting on the smaller country. In Ukraine, we are witnessing something similar to genocide. I mean, basically executing civilians, killing people with their hands tied behind their backs, shot in the back of the head, and all that. In case of Israel, 73 war, Arabs didn't capture any civilian centers of Israel, but they were very brutal toward the prisoners of war. And there was cases where the prisoners with their hands tied behind their backs were executed, like gangland style. So both countries, both aggressors, were showing like absolute brutality, just wanton killing, which was designed to terrify the other nation. In case of Russia, it's more to terrify the other nation. In case of Arab countries, it was probably just hatred, but also desire to terrify, I imagine.
Yeah, I think from the Egyptian side, I did a little bit of research on that when I was writing Sagger, and it seemed to me that from the Egyptian side, it was more to terrify the enemy, like a scare tactic. General Shazli was publishing pamphlets that's how Egyptian
Oh yeah,
soldiers should behave towards Israeli soldiers. But on the Syrian side, I think it was more from a position of hate, because, for example, the Syrian Defense Minister Tlass was awarded a Moroccan mercenary the Medal of Honor for actually cutting up an Israeli with an axe and eating his flesh. And that story was very difficult to come by, but because it wasn't published in Israel because of how gruesome it was. I found it by translating some minutes from the Syrian parliament.
but
And
you also mentioned Shazli writing a pamphlet about the conduct of war. But that pamphlet stipulated to actually brutally mutilating and killing prisoners. So this wasn't a pamphlet saying, hey, we have to be civil and to follow the Geneva Convention. Quite the opposite. It was a policy.
not that it was not that it was being civil, but I think that if he was motivated more, less from hate and more more to win the war
fear.
Yeah, by inflicting fear. Whereas Tlass also published a lot of like anti-Semitic publications before the war, and he was like a vehement anti-Semite. So I just think in this case of Syria, it was more from a position of hate, and from Egypt, although I'm sure there was like hate involved there too, it was more
It was
as a scare
effective,
tactic for
yeah, scare
effective
tactic.
warfare.
And the same scare tactic motivates Russians, but it's a policy of the state. It's not some wanton uh, act of barbarity by one soldier, couple of soldiers,
Yeah,
but this is actually an uh, mandated and instilled by the state in case of Egypt and in case of Russia, a policy with a specific goal in mind, goal of terrorizing the other population. So here is a big similarity that what Shazali was doing with his pamphlet, what Putin is doing by condoning and actually recommending this sort of activity to terrify.
yeah,
They both are serving as a substitute to winning on the battlefield, because notice that neither Russia is able to win in the battle on the battlefield near Kiev, and Arabs were not able to win on the battlefield. So they were looking for some other methods, and terrifying the population with barbarity, with torture, was
right.
one of those methods.
Although the difference is that Arabs didn't capture civilian centers, so we don't have data
That was
about
the difference. Yeah.
how they treated the civilian population, whereas unfortunately, Russians have
Have
captured
captured
cities, and
population centers,
yeah,
but we can only guess what Arabs would do with the population centers if they capture some towns in Israel. Probably would be
yeah,
no different than Russia in Bucha and other places where they, did mass killings of civilians. Listen, it's pretty good that we talk about those issues. I would like to meet again and talk about more similarities and differences, because the analogies are really stunning between the two wars.
yes, absolutely. So we'll see you guys next time. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.